Well, glory to Jesus Christ. Hello, I'm Dr. Matthew Minard. Some of the viewers here at Reason and Theology might know me from my various talks that I've given for Michael Lofton on various topics, a whole series of lectures on the Summa Theologiae, kind of free-form reflection on the elements of Thomism, some talks on publications that I've had, talks on the debates over theological methodology that occurred in the mid-century of the 20th century, and some stuff on Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council. I'm a professor of moral theology and philosophy at the Byzantine Catholic Seminary of St. Cyril and Methodius in Pittsburgh. And so the topic of this symposium is dear to my heart, given the work that we do at St. Cyril and Methodius on behalf of the Ruthenian Byzantine Church, as well Byzantine Catholic Church, as well as the Melkite Byzantine Catholic Church as well. We are formators for especially those two jurisdictions. On occasion, we do receive men from the Romanian Catholic Church, which is very small, as well as the Ukrainian Catholic Church on occasion, if they have a kind of special case that they need to have formation for, although we're not the primary formators for them. I also am a translator and author, primarily of 20th century scholastic and scholastic-derived texts. I was born as a Roman Catholic, and my own training was in a Roman context. And I fell in love with the Ruthenian Church 6 or 7 years ago now. In southwestern Pennsylvania, the experience of a pastor who was quite Byzantine in his spirituality, but just simple Slavic liturgical form in western Pennsylvania that kind of broke the ice of my heart almost immediately. And although I was somewhat engaged in a Western traditional Latin Mass world, I immediately knew that I had found my home spiritually, no doubt in part because of my own kind of Benedictine and monastic spirituality, which is so at home in the great, an ancient ascetical mystical tradition of the Byzantine East. At the Byzantine Catholic Seminary, which I'm not explicitly, speaking on behalf of the seminary here today, but nonetheless, we're very engaged in trying to build bridges with our Orthodox brethren. The great hope of many of us is that we would someday be united with our Orthodox brethren and be able to consider ourselves as Orthodox in union with Rome. And again, that's not necessarily the way that everyone speaks, but it is the great desire ecumenically that we all have. I don't think that today we're going to solve every issue. And I'm just going to speak on some of the kind of topics that come up in the course of my teaching and discussing of things with my fellow colleagues and my fellow Byzantine Catholics and the men that we form for our various jurisdictions. And, above all, there will be this question in the background of our mind concerning, well, what prevents union? Probably I could come up with a different list than what I did, and others will fill in the gaps as well, and our conversation will too. But I want to just consider three main topics of differing length. Each one is at a very practical level, questions of governance, which are quite strong, and in some ways I think maybe perhaps the strongest of issues because of the problem of the relationship between the common good of the universal church and the particular churches in union with the Pope of Rome. This is an important area in which our Orthodox brethren do have certain concerns about a centralizing tendency that sometimes tends to level things out from Rome outward. Secondly, I'll consider matters of theology. And here, I suppose we will engage in a bit of reflection based on my own experience as a Byzantine Catholic philosopher and theologian. And my own experience as my theological outlook has changed. I do all of this work in the scholastic world, and yet I just had a very funny conversation recently, actually, someone I was talking to. I do a little bit of teaching as well for a Roman Catholic seminary. And the person I was talking to said, well, so do you consider yourself a Thomist? And they had read things that I'd translated. And I laughed and I said, well, I believe in pluralism quite a bit. And I do think that I'm quite indebted to the Thomist school, but I guess it's, my time as a Byzantine has changed my outlook somewhat. So it's just some of the questions in the background of difficulties that would be felt, because I know what it's like to feel them myself as a Ruthenian Byzantine. Will be the second topic: difficulties regarding theological grammar, if you will, theological methodology, theological culture. Finally, I'll make a few remarks about the thorniness that is the existence of the churches, such as my own, which are sometimes pejoratively referred to as uniate churches or Eastern Catholic churches in union with Rome. And this is actually still a sticking point, I think, for kind of an honest appreciation of the state of the churches. And I will be somewhat of a both lamenter of the sorrow of what uniatism comes to represent historically, but also to a defender of the experience of the various Eastern Catholic churches, which can't be completely just washed away as though this were, just a Roman imposition to be overcome completely, by sort of like quashing our existence. This is a real fear that some in the churches in union with Rome feel. Okay, matters of governance. Well, we can't go into all the details concerning, the relationship between the Pope of Rome and various particular churches, but a good place to start is to consider really the thorny issue that we feel in the East, whether from an Orthodox perspective or an Eastern Catholic perspective, when reading the fourth chapter of Pastor Aeternus, the Declaration on the Church, the Constitution on the Church, from the First Vatican Council. And although later documents, I think, have, we'll say, mollified and they've softened the language of the universal and ordinary jurisdiction of the Roman Pontiff over the Church, nonetheless, the stark language of Pastor Aeternus, not merely about matters of infallibility, which I'm not so worried about here today, but as regards the governance of the church as a whole, is something of concern for the East, and I think rightly so. The Melkite Patriarch, at the time of the council, himself refused at first to sign the document, precisely because he wanted to have an addition to the text that would recognize the rights that belong to the patriarchs, and of course also to the bishops. And there's a book by a somewhat, perhaps a little bit progressive, but still insightful theologian, Potmeyer is his last name, that goes through some of the details of those who intervened at the council on behalf of the expression of the rights of the bishops. This is one of the reasons that Lumen Gentium at the Second Vatican Council had to be written, was to try to counterbalance the papal maximalism that was found at the First Vatican Council. This is also, you can also find some similar accounts in the volumes written by or curated by Cuthbert Butler on behalf of, who was it? It was Archabbot or Abbot Ullathorne, who was present at the council. And so you can find some of the interventions by council fathers looking to have softening language or canons or texts. And there's responses from the deputation, which function as at least a somewhat official interpretation of the final text. And all of that can be found in the Manzi collection. I think the council fathers were raising important issues concerning what do we do about redressing when the Pope acts out of line by kind of reaching down and doing things where really it should be left to, if not the bishop, then to at least the metropolitan or the major metropolitan church, as we think in the Catholic East, or the patriarch. The Western church has developed canons and other provisions which have recognized increasingly the rights of the various churches as such. This is strongest in the case of patriarchal churches, and this provides at least a kind of model for what the interaction would be like between West and East if there were a reunion. Obviously, I think it would actually be a foolish thing to just expect the Orthodox churches to accept the Code of Canon Law for the Eastern churches. The document itself is very Roman in style. What the canonical layout would look like between the churches would probably have to be something a little bit more suppler in order to have kind of a developed set of interfaces that work legally. But the provisions that have been made to try to respect the autonomy and the subsidiarity of patriarchs at least provides a good first set of steps for thinking through the independence of the various churches. Now, still, though, Rome sometimes, this has been true under Paul VI, and then John Paul II, and then Benedict XVI, and Francis, the papacy exercises itself sometimes quite vigorously among the bishops, though directly at times. I mean, there's, people overstate this sometimes. Rome does take care to actually not do much, is sort of the way it happens. But there are things that occur that would strike an Orthodox listener as being at least troubling, how a kind of immediacy unfolds. Now, it's important, though, that the point of comparison is always at least above all, the Eastern patriarchal churches. But I think that still the West is learning how to think through its own subsidiary structures more explicitly. There's a way in which the episcopacy is chosen in some ways for a kind of go along to get along with Rome attitude. And it does tend toward an exercise of jurisdiction that has an immediacy which feels quite immediate. But, especially the Melkite Patriarchate functions for those of us in the Byzantine East as really a point of hope for asserting an Eastern identity and an Eastern posture in ecclesiastical affairs, which is strong and robust. But of course, also too, a larger Eastern church like the Ukrainian Catholic Church, even though it's just major metropolitan, also bears witness to this same kind of desire for independence but union with Rome. But this is an open issue, what this would look like, because not all Eastern Catholics are always happy with the relationship that we have. For instance, with the Roman Congregation for the East, there's a sense in which we feel like we're an issue that's being handled by the Roman authorities. And I think this was going to be one of these sticking points, because if it sticks for us, it's going to stick for those who are not used to these sorts of interactions. And so one will just, hope that lessons learned from us or our interactions with the Roman authorities can give structures for moving forward to an even more independent and truly synodal church. One of the issues, people talk about synodality today in the Western church quite a bit because of this synod on synodality that's going on. But of course, the East has a rich idea of how the synodal structure works within eparchies and then at various levels. But of course, as we've seen historically, especially of late, the lack of explicit union with the head creates its own issues regarding union, and that's something that's going to be an issue then to be faced if there is reunion, and it's not going to be easy. And so you have to really want union together to be able to suffer some of the oversteps that still exist. Rome still, in a sense, has baked into its mindset a kind of allergy to conciliarism and to Gallicanism that has not, wholly been exercised, and I'm not sure it ever quite will be. So one has to sort of be willing to suffer some of the oversteps, and also to occasionally have a strong spine. The Patriarch of Antioch, the Catholic Patriarch of Antioch, the Catholic Melkite Patriarch of Antioch, has been is always quite inspiring in this way, and we owe a great deal to the Melkite readiness to stand up and just not follow along if they feel that their own prerogatives are being pushed on. I mean, they're not disobedient, but they're they assert their rights. So, I mean, one has to be ready to live like that. Okay, well then, theology. Union will cause, how to put it, a certain level of discomfort. We live in a much more pluralistic time. This is not the kind of pan-neo-scholasticism of the West of the maybe 20s and 30s, before things started to fracture apart. We live in a wildly pluralistic world in the West. On the one hand, truth be told, I think we need to be quite honest, the Roman permission, Rome's always very slow to respond to problematic theologians, and many bishops don't rein in theologians and philosophers who are problematic within their own diocese. And union with the Catholic Church is going to face the Orthodox with this fact, I think, quite strongly. While there are, in certain sections of Orthodoxy, veins of more liberal and progressive thought of today, especially in the first world, they have not faced the same kind of test that the West has faced in this regard for especially the past 50 years. I mean, there are those who consider themselves to be Catholic theologians, who may have a certain kind of technical proficiency, but their desire to really be engaged with the ancient tradition is nominal at best, and is taken in by the fads of today at worst. And learning what in the world to do there, or even like choosing whether or not one wants to deal with that phenomenon, is, I think, a significant barrier to entry, actually. But also, too, there's a sense in which the Western Church, in its more conservative sides, has a huge amount of the scholastic inheritance involved in its vocabulary. Even its universal vocabulary has many marks of scholastic thought within it. Very highly Augustinianized categories, which is not a bad thing. Poor Augustine gets a bad rap. I think that sort of a disavowing of the anti-Augustine lines that crept into Orthodoxy is a necessary thing, because Augustine is a great saint and was a great theologian. He wasn't the only one, but he had immense influence on the way that Westerners sort of thought their categories. And then the hardening of lines that happens not only in the 13th century, but in the 15th and 16th and 17th century in theology, in a scholastic idiom, and in the terms of a kind of scholastic view of what theology is as a particular kind of so-called science. All of this creates a world in which that mode of theologizing in certain circles, and really even pretty mainstream up through the time of Benedict XVI, both John Paul II and Benedict XVI, was encouraged by the official magisterium. Things are a little bit different nowadays, but the point being is that one finds oneself somewhat swamped in the midst of a kind of scholastic idiom. And yet I think that there's much to be gained by a kind of interaction in this way. Marcus Plested has encouraged his own Orthodox brethren to have confidence in discussing theology, even among scholastics, even meeting them in their own idiom, even whenever one looks on this or that point within whichever tradition, be it a spiritual theological tradition, a particular Palamite tradition, a particular view of certain themes in the fathers of the church, certain views on scriptural or biblical theology, that even, and I forget where my sentence started, I apologize, that in the midst of interacting with a scholastic idiom, one should have a kind of comfort with trying to understand on its own terms scholastic thought, and then a backbone, whatever your tradition might be, to stand up and however theologize in a way that is faithful to the mysteries as they've been traditionally given to us. And different churches will have different ways of doing this. This is one of the great difficulties of being a Ruthenian Catholic in this regard, because we don't have a huge theological tradition per se, right? And so, I've become, in my days as an Eastern Catholic, very, comfortable, of course, interacting with Orthodox authors in a way that whenever I grew up as a Roman Catholic, I had not, to be honest. But nonetheless, you have a keen sense as a Ruthenian that, well, you don't have a tradition of sorts to on the whole, give you many years of theological inquiry. We're a poor and small church. So there will be many different theologies, and one should feel fine, but it's also difficult because, like, in the room, in the end, everyone's talking Western because it's such a big Western world in the Catholic Church. And I've become quite sensitive to this. Someone said to me recently, I was actually talking about a rather scholastic topic of the manuals and the history of how that genre began. So it's very quintessentially Western, and it's kind of like 17th, 18th, 19th century focus. And someone said, I can tell you're an Easterner because you never say the theology, right? You don't talk about Western things and equate it with theology. You always kind of, qualify something about the Latin West at a certain period in a certain group of people who were scholastic in this way. So, well, yeah, because, I do believe that, theological inquiry has a certain kind of unity to it. It may not be quite the capital S science that one looks for the one science on the model of the somewhat rationalistic feeling bent of certain scholastics. But, that aside, the pluralism is quite important. But it does grate on you sometimes, even someone like myself who does so much in the Western world, to hear, conversations as though the entire categories are within a certain idiom of certain issues that arose in a certain Western context because of the vicissitudes of history over the past 100 years or whatever. This also shows that on a particular topic that I think maybe a fruitful point of contact, I think would be very fruitful, actually, to maybe discuss at our group, or maybe, discussion of this kind of technicality might be too much, but to start making a kind of joint effort between Eastern Catholics and Orthodox thinkers would be to actually articulate a view of development of dogma that enables us to explain the fact that we hold the same dogmatic truths, but dogmatic truths, not merely even theological truths, but dogmatic truths using notions that have different nuances, but that's just because of different areas of the tradition of the councils and the fathers that have had different emphasis within our own history. And so, there's a kind of way that the church contains within her own bosom multiple strata of the development of dogmas. People tend to think, especially in the West, as though there's just a sort of linear development of the state of a dogma and its articulation magisterially, and it's stamped every so often by the papacy. I think that coming up appropriately with a theory of development of dogma that is more nuanced to the concerns of the East, which blessedly are almost always biased in the direction of maintaining the same truth, and hence has a kind of conservative and traditional power to it, that this would be a very interesting way to try to kind of have conversations on the interface, if you will, between the Byzantine Catholic East and the Orthodox East, whatever particular church in question. It'd be an interesting symposium to hold, actually. It's an academic conference, to be honest. But, you're going to find forever a kind of papalist, somewhat Denzinger feeling theology. People made fun of the idea of going to Denzinger to open it up and find your kind of stuff from the councils and from the popes. They made fun of that in the 50s, but there's a sense in which progressives today find themselves quoting many papal documents as well, and you just need to be prepared to be comfortable in the midst of that. It's not the only way to theologize, and the magisterium actually is quite careful to protect pluralism, but it's easy to miss it, especially if you're not used to this sort of idiom. And obviously there will be growing pains. There are issues on, especially feel it when the liturgy and the sacraments come up, because very often the categories for thinking through the ways that the mystery is lived either in the liturgy or is communicated in the sacraments or the sacramental mysteries is quite Latin and also Latin liturgical. But that's more of a kind of the kinds of projects and things one will find one's life taken up with. But it shouldn't be, in my mind, a dissuasion from union. Rome has repeatedly emphasized to the Eastern churches to embrace our tradition. And that's a hard thing to think through whenever you're, for instance, a small and poor church, right? But how can we be authentically, yes, Catholic, but Eastern and Byzantine? And so, there are people who do great work on liturgical theology above all, and also to the sacramental mysteries that I think is fruitful territory. And so, okay, fine, it just has to develop even more. The idiom of the relationship between philosophy and theology will be an issue. Not because, of course, there's so many great, not because it's lacking in the East. I mean, there are many, both contemporary, but then also through the centuries, Orthodox thinkers who clearly are making use of philosophy as a very carefully managed instrument for theology. They're not as sanguine as the West can be at times. But that issue of then the relationship between faith and reason and how important the philosophical instrument is another one of these things that will come up, I think, quite a bit. I mean, this is a normal thing with my students, and some of our other professors as well, really have to make this point about you need a certain philosophical acumen because the fathers themselves had it, as well as later theologians in the Byzantine tradition. And yet still there's not the same philosophical culture like what develops in the West, which spins off independently in a way that's much more full-throated in the West. One of the very practical issue has somewhat to do with governance and somewhat to do with theology. Whereas I think that issues that people often talk about, be it the filioque or purgatory, or even perhaps the articulation of papal subsidiarity, if you will, actually can be handled pretty well, and have been in various ecumenical dialogues. The practical issue of ecclesiastical divorce in the Orthodox churches is something that is going to cause significant issues. Just exactly how I'm not sure, because it could play out in different ways, but nonetheless, that's an issue set that's an issue that's going to cause problems. Now, the various times in the history of the various Orthodox churches, there's been a pulling back from the granting of such ecclesiastical divorces, but still, practically, that's a kind of example of something where the rubber hits the road pretty fast. So, finally, let's just quickly go to my third category, which I've already mentioned, and it's somewhat in the background. An example. The churches the Eastern churches in union with Rome sometimes have the feeling that if there's anyone who our Orthodox brethren don't like, maybe they're mad at Roman Catholics, for various theological or even past political reasons, but our existence is something that's hated even more. And at the level of fraternal charity among parties, I think it's very important to voice this sense that we are the ones who are hated. Think about how we've been treated especially just speak of the Slavic context, by the Russian Orthodox Church very often. And although both sides I acknowledge, and I will wholly acknowledge that both sides always will tell their own story, right? And everyone has sort of their own tale. Nonetheless, we have been significantly mistreated in the history of our time in the East, in kind of the home country. And although some of that can be blamed on communism, not all of it can be, and we feel sort of the pain of that fact still in certain circles in our church. I myself have great hope for a kind of reconciliation. Of course, in our church's case, the autocephaly of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is actually a sign of hope for us to be able to perhaps someday, have a mother church that we would be in union with, and that we would be part of. That would really be the great goal, is to be Orthodox in union with Rome. That the Melkite Patriarchate has, from what I understand, the Patriarch has said for some time that if the Patriarch of Antioch, the Antiochian Orthodox Patriarch, were to wish for reunion, he would step down, the Melkite Catholic Patriarch. Now, I don't know if that's current policy or not, but it does bear witness to the fact that the Melkites take very seriously that desire to be Orthodox in union with Rome. And although, there's perhaps a little bit more of this Greek Catholic, we're not Orthodox attitude that you find somewhat in the Rust Belt, in the Ruthenian and maybe even in the Ukrainian church, nonetheless, many of the, younger, by which I mean 50 years old and younger, Eastern Catholics have a real desire, maybe even older than that, have a real desire to move toward real union. But it has to be admitted that our churches have had a history of spirituality and practices, not the Latinizations that are used to be everywhere in our liturgy, but have been slowly but surely taken out, or in our parish practice, I should say, not just liturgy, but in our parish practice. But there are things in certain devotional strands in people's lives. There's a kind of the effect of living side by side with Roman Catholics. Like, all of this is something that it needs to be worked through, and a more vibrant Eastern culture should always be what we're working toward in our church. But one has to also accept our particular existence and the particular story of our people and the particular story of our churches, that our churches are not nothing, and that they should be recognized as groups of Christians who wanted to be faithful to the gospel and to the divine liturgy, and to the liturgical and spiritual patrimony of the Christian East, sometimes in the midst of nations where they were here in America, they were utter outliers that didn't fit in. And I'm not justifying every Latinization, by far not, but a kind of clear statement of affirmation that the Uniates are not evil, that the Unia, for whatever are the problems of Uniatism, and Bishop Elias Zogby saw them very clearly, and in many ways articulated them spot on, to be honest, that we who are so-called Uniates, or churches in union with Rome, deserve a place at the table and not to be forgotten, or at least looked at as very annoying ecclesial bodies. I mean, I don't support some of the overreactions, for instance, to the joint statement from Balamand, which gave rise to, for instance, a breakoff group in the Ukrainian church that the SSPX was involved in. But I do understand the kind of frustration at being treated or talked about as basically this unmitigated evil. It was a kind of church, like the taking of flocks in a certain sense. Like I think that one could sort of admit that, but they were flocks who were looking for pastoral care. They weren't merely just being stolen by Rome. Rome itself, and it misstepped at times, but Rome itself had been quite clear from early on that we were to maintain our Eastern practices, or our Byzantine practices. And it's an unfortunate thing that locally that was not always the case. But, it was because Rome wanted to provide for the spiritual life of these particular communities. And so seeing it as part of just the vicissitudes of history, with perhaps, yes, some involuntary, unhappy consequences, but in the end, not something to be, just decried as evil, I think would be very important, and is one of these steps of comfort that are necessary as the churches would hopefully move toward kind of reunion, which would be very desirable. Look, I went to a liturgy down at Holy Transfiguration Parish in McLean, Virginia. If anyone wants to see what a church in union with Rome can look like, and look almost like a kind of Antiochian paradise, it's that Melkite church. It was an absolutely beautiful liturgy, stunning and fulfilling as an Easterner. And if we can enter a world in which places like that and liturgies like that are celebrated and then accepted eventually in a way that is appropriate into a unified structure, I think that the church would be, the ancient faith, the traditional faith would be all the more benefited by that kind of union, because the great desire of Christ was to have a union among all of his believers. But the church is a bit of a dragnet with good and bad fish and has weeds and wheat. And so just because the papacy might be a pain to deal with sometimes, I just don't think it should impede, Eastern brethren being united together. But anyway, that's my spiel for today, and I look forward to the discussion that we will have together. But I want to wish all of my Orthodox interlocutors just, my true fraternal love, and I mean that in a non-condescending way. And I wish, of course, my Eastern Catholic, and maybe if there are any Latin Catholic people here as well, folks that are also part of the symposium here. It just, love of, brother from another particular church. I want to thank you on both sides for engaging in this kind of discussion, which the great desire of all of our hearts should be, to be one, not merely, to kind of have a kind of conquest on behalf of Orthodoxy, but to have a true unity and communion in the body of our Lord and our shared liturgy and our shared spiritual tradition. So I wish all of you all the best. We're not going to solve all the problems of the church ourselves, but I hope we can at least model a bit of fraternal love together as brothers and sisters who share the same tradition, broadly speaking. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to our discussion.